No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Juliet Schor. Juliet is a professor of sociology at Boston College. She's also an economist who worked for 17 years prior to her stint at Boston College, 17 years at Harvard University. She's a best-selling author and has written some fascinating, very provocative books, and delighted to share with you today the conversation that we had with Juliet. One of the reasons I love this conversation with Juliet is that she challenges some of the economic and work presumptions we have so taken for granted. And I think this is central. These kinds of conversations are central to a discussion around a good life because, one, simply the immense time that we spend working in our lives. And second, because of the ways in which she so carefully diagnoses the consumerist economy that has taken hostage our definition of the good life. Fascinating, remarkable conversation. Seldom does one get to speak to someone who may be on the cutting edge of wide, sweeping social trends. In this case, a move toward a 4-day work week. I don't know yet what we will do with her insight and research, but I'm undoubtedly paying attention, further considering, and listening. In the meanwhile, enjoy. Here's Juliet Schor. It's summertime, and that means I'm now planning some of my summer adventures with my lovely wife, Laura. But wherever summer takes us, we all need nourishment that keeps up with our daily adventures. So I'm quite pleased to have just learned about cassava. Here's my experience so far, that the cassava whole body meal shake first tastes great. I must say, I thought it might not be possible, given that it is chock full of amazing stuff like 26 vitamins and minerals, 85 plus superfoods and nutrients, all to keep your body and mind nourished all day. I love me some coconut, so I immediately tried the coconut acai and was honestly surprised how great it tasted. I was also especially pleased to see that the 25 grams of protein in each serving is plant-based. So fill your day with cassava. Go to cassava.com and use code ENDEAVOR for 15% off your next order. That's cassava.com, KACHAVA.com, code ENDEAVOR for 15% off. Lately, my lovely wife, Laura, and I have been trying to clean up the way we do a lot of our chores and errands to simplify our lives. And so one of the ways we've tried to do that is to clean up the way we shop for groceries. And so recently we gave Thrive Market a shot. And honestly, we're a big fan. You can get the same high-quality brands you love, but for less and without compromising your standards. They actually ban over 1,000 ingredients that are still allowed in U.S. products, and the site is super easy to shop. You can filter by diet, like gluten-free, paleo, keto, low sugar, vegan, so you're not wasting time reading every label. It's not just food. Thrive has supplements, household items, and clean beauty too. All vetted and all way more affordable than you or I expect. And the shipping, fast and carbon neutral. Head over to thrivemarket.com/endeavor to get 30% off your first order and a free $60 gift. That's thrivemarket.com/endeavor, thrivemarket.com/endeavor. Hello, friends. One of the things I've taught students for many years now is that one of the most important things they can do is pay attention to their meta habits. Big habits that leave lots of things in their wake, and that this is key to living life well. For centuries, the cardinal virtues were thought of as just such meta habits, profound practices that have a disproportionately large impact upon your life. The 4 cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. They were considered essential to a good life, but today we hardly talk about them. Most people can't even name them. That's why we're launching a special 4-part series exclusively on NSE+. In this series, I'll take a deep dive into these virtues, what they mean, why they matter, and how they shape a meaningful life. Think of it like a private college course, except it's way practical. Join us on NSE Plus to start listening today. Sign up at nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus. Juliet Schor is an economist and a professor of sociology at Boston College. She's the best-selling author of numerous books, including The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and After the Gig. Prior to her tenure at Boston College, she was on the faculty at Harvard for 17 years, and she holds a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's been featured across national and international media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes, The Today Show, and Good Morning America. And we're pleased today to add no small endeavor to that list. And today we'll especially be discussing her newest book, 4 Days a Week. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
Delighted to have you with us and grateful to get to have this conversation with you today. Our tagline of our show is exploring what it means to live a good life. And it seems to me that in many ways you are doing precisely that in asking us to reconsider how we define the good life or define a good life. Is that a fair assessment of what you're trying to get us to consider?
Absolutely. Back in the 90s, I co-founded an organization with some friends, and it was called the Center for a New American Dream, and our tagline was "More of what really matters."
Oh, wow.
So
Nice.
I'm absolutely on your wavelength.
Well, we'll have lots to discuss about this, but I would like, kind of in the first part of our conversation, we're going to get to spend a lot of time talking about your new book, 4 Days a Week. But as we kind of work our way there, I would love to explore some of the themes that have been important in your work throughout the last number of years. And kind of under the rubric of asking first, where do you see that we are? Second, where might we be headed, the implications of the kind of practices that you are elucidating and pointing us to, diagnosing in our current context. And then third, where might you wish we would go? So let's first start then with where are we? As I said, you've been diagnosing concerning, if not distressing trends for your entire career. And so give us kind of a sketch of what you have been paying attention to all these years that concerns you.
Yes. So as you mentioned, the first book that I wrote, The Overworked American, was really looking at what was going on in the United States. It came out in 1992. And what I was seeing was that in contrast to what people expected, which was they thought we'd have a 4-day week by the 1970s. Actually, Richard Nixon predicted in the 50s that we were on our way to a 4-day week, that we'd have a crisis of leisure time, that we would be living the good life. And of course, there were many reasons to think that the country was getting richer and richer. There was, pretty much peace, domestic peace, people getting along. The country was getting more and more equal in those years after the Second World War. So, that's the nostalgic period that many people look back to. Of course, there were many problems with it, but what I saw beginning this work in the 1980s was that in contrast to people getting more free time, actually working hours had started moving in the other direction, and they were getting longer and longer and longer. And at the time I wrote the book, there was kind of a crisis of free time, a crisis that people didn't have enough. People were feeling stressed out, overly busy, lots of attention to how people just had been sped up and were stressed. And so the book is an analysis of why and how that happened. And there are a couple of parts to it. There's the economic part to it, and what was going on. Why was it that employers were asking for longer and longer hours from people? Then the other side of it is, why were they giving those hours? Why were we in those hours? And there are sort of three pieces of that. One is the economic incentives that developed for the employer were to hire fewer people and work them longer hours. Some of it was just happenstance because they were paying health insurance on a per person basis in the firm rather than, say, having government financed health insurance. And health insurance was getting so expensive, they didn't want to entitle more people to it. So better to have fewer people work them longer hours. So that was one piece, sort of employer incentives. The second piece of it was that starting it in sort of the late 70s, and, eventually it gets much more extreme, but we start to see a reversal of those equalizing trends that were going on in the economy. So that building of a middle class, kind of compression of sort of the differences between one end of the income distribution and the other. So that was like one of the really great things about that post-war period was that coming together, and that sort of, when you have that economic coming together, you also get that the social coming together. Now, of course, we're in the opposite situation, which is we have levels of extreme inequality beyond anything that we've seen in history. And we see our society is coming apart at the seams. But it also turns out that when you have more income inequality, you tend to have longer hours of work. So that was another factor. And I'm not sure we understand everything about why that is, but there's a lot of evidence now for that. And then the third piece of it was what I called the cycle of work and spend. And that, I think, it sort of definitely connects with issues of the good life, because one question does the good life mean just having lots of stuff, which is one, in many ways, very American definition of what the good life is, or does it mean something else? And what I showed in the book is that if you ask people at the beginning of the year, what would you rather have, a raise in income or more free time? People were saying they wanted more free time. This was back then. I think things have changed a bit, and we could talk about that. And then you ask them again, but they always got the income because the employers didn't want to give free time. The employers really wanted to keep people working those longer hours. A year later, when you ask them, you probably, if they were consistent, they would say, well, I would prefer the free time, but now they don't want to give up the income. Once they get the income,
right,
you need the income. You spend it. You buy stuff. You get used to it. And so people's preferences changed along with the income. So they kept getting more income and not free time, and so they kept wanting more income. And I sort of distinguish between the conventional economic story, which is that workers get what they want. And so if you see people in a country working long hours, it's because that's what they prefer. And who are you, Juliet Schor, to come along and say people work too long, right? But what I was arguing there was people ended up wanting what they'd gotten. So rather than getting what they want what they've gotten. So they acclimate. And that cycle of work and spend is really important in understanding, in many ways, how we've gone off the rails for the good life, because the economy sort of, the incentives in the economy have pushed us always toward work longer, work more, grow faster, produce more, et cetera, rather than, look, we're getting more and more productive. We could have more free time. And if we did, it would allow us to have a higher quality of life. It would allow us to get to the good life. And, we can talk about the components of that, but working long hours to sort of fuel an ever-increasing lifestyle that gives you a lot of stress, I think for many people didn't lead to the good life.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost as you're describing all of that, in theological terms and or more philosophical terms, a lot of times we'll talk about formation, and that a lot of times people will assume that desires are given. But what instead, there's a lot of research and philosophical work done on the ways in which desires are formed, right? They're or even manufactured. And you're kind of pointing to the ways in which these larger social and economic trends have shaped our desire. In this case, I want more money instead of more time, and I want to spend more, and then that makes me want to have more money, and that makes me want to spend more. That becomes kind of our self, that we're formed into that kind of way of being. And in your next book, I guess it's your next book, The Overspent American, it's as I kind of understand what you do in that book, you don't necessarily seem to be blaming marketers, but instead asking the question, well, how is it that we have made spending itself this kind of social art, that we're not thinking about what we need as much as maybe it's a sort of performative thing that somehow gives us a sense of accomplishment or goodness?
Well, I love that you said the book isn't sort of pointing the finger at marketers, because too many people have read it that way, but absolutely. So it was my next book. And the reason I wrote it was when I was giving talks on the overworked American, someone in an audience raised her hand and say, how do we get out of the cycle of work and spend? And as an economist, I really didn't have an answer to that. So I started thinking a lot more about that. It is what led me into sociology as well. And the answer in that book is it's really about the social pressures to spend, the way in which society is oriented, sort of set up, structured, such that our spending patterns, what we have, the kind of house we live in, the car, what we're wearing on our wrist, etc. Those things are really key in establishing our social identities. Why? Well, it's just the way we've set society up. They didn't need to be, but that is the way our society works to a large extent. And so in order to keep up, in order to sort of achieve and maintain a social position, people have to spend to that level that they're aspiring to. And what I argued in that book is that, and this again, that sort of shift from an equalizing society to one which was getting more and more unequal was really key. What I argued was happening at the time, so that book came out in the 90s, was that growing income divide was leading to a bigger gap between what people were trying to achieve, which was, basically some kind of middle-class status, and what their incomes allowed them to. And so that created, I called it the aspirational gap. And that gap between what we feel we need and, what the average person can afford has grown by a lot. And that creates a level of dissatisfaction. One of the pieces of research for the book asked people about what we call in social science a reference group. So who is it that you look to in terms of their standard of living? Your friends, family, etc. And then how much money do you have in comparison to those people in your group? And what I found was that people who had less money than the people they associate with spend more and save less. People who have more money, people whose social circles are people with lower financial status than they have, tend to spend less and save more. So it's the social context that really matters. I'll give you one more anecdote from that book. I had a student at the time who lived in Arlington, Virginia, which was a town that had lots of little houses, but it was a time of booming real estate. People were buying these, tearing them down and building, big mansions on small plots of land. And her house was always the biggest house on the block. And what happened was that somebody else moved in next door, did a tear down, and built a much bigger house. And her mother lost her mind. She went to court to block it. She became consumed. So it's just the point that our relative position really matters. If everybody else has a small house, okay.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So it's that social context that sort of tells us what's enough, what isn't enough, what we should aspire to, what's over the top, etc. We are super social beings, and the spending piece of it is really key. And when you have an economy that's constantly generating more growth, more growth, more growth, whoever it's going to, if it's going, the people at the top, then everybody's looking at them. Or if it's going more equally, but that just it's the never-ending escalator of consumer desire.
It's ironic the example that you gave, because I was, my wife and I live in a very comfortable neighborhood, and when we moved here 20 years ago this summer, it was a very comfortable neighborhood, but in contemporary Nashville standards, it's a pretty modest sized house that we live in. And what's happened in the last 15 years is that very many, I would guess, 50% of the lots in our neighborhood, the old houses built in the 1950s, have been torn down, and as you said, huge houses placed up in their place. And it's a sort of, I don't know, I experience it sometimes as the phrase I wrote down just now as you were talking is contagion of desire. It's almost like it's a social contagion, right? It's like I was very content in my house, very pleased with my house. And just paid off our mortgage. I feel very excited about that. But again, there's this sort of, when everybody around me, literally there's a brand new huge house being built literally across the street from where I sit on my front porch every morning. And the one behind us, and the one next to that behind that, and the one next to that, and the one on this side. And so it's a sort of, when it's constantly in your face, I naturally began to say, oh, maybe we need a bigger house, right? So what, your reply was not, let's don't blame the marketers. It's social trends. But what's driving those social trends, you think? How do you, as a sociologist, from that discipline, identify what drives the contagion of desire, or what drives the sort of building that precipitates a contagion of desire?
Yeah, well, there I have to put my economist hat back on, I think. Which is, I think what the sociology tells us is sort of how it works out. The economics gives us the escalator, the fact that what we desire is more and more expensive, higher and higher. Now, many people will say that's human nature, and I would disagree with that. We have an economy which is always producing more. And that more goes why is the economy, let's hold population or labor force changes off to the side. So just for a given population, we've got productivity growth happening. So every year, let's say it's 3%. Every year we can produce 3% more. Now, we could be a society like many in Europe, and like we used to be for a long, for a decade, a century. We could be a society that takes either some or even all of that productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work by saying, you know what, we're materially okay here. We've got enough. Let's give ourselves time. And we'll pivot to what that having time does for us and how it gets us to the good life, I'm sure. But we've gone down the other path, which is let's just produce more, 3% more every year, more. And so that more shows up in people's pockets as increased income. Now, granted, people may be listening to this and saying, what is she talking about? I haven't gotten a raise in many years. There's definitely a big segment of our population which has not been getting the fruits of that productivity increase. And it's gone increasingly over time, more and farther up the distribution. But for the period I was writing about, the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, and into the 90s, people were getting those increases. When the money comes into your pocket and it burns a hole in the pocket, because when we get the money, the social pressures are to spend it. Because as long as somebody starts spending it, the rest of us, keep up. Right, the Joneses got the new car or the washing machine or whatever it was, depending on the era, and so that the sort of economic incentives are for that expansion, and the social tell us why so many of us participate in it, why it becomes, embarrassing to have a beat up old car when everybody is driving a late model, or why, despite the fact that you are an incredible student of the good life and you know that the size of your house is not going to determine how good a life you have as you sit there on your porch, in the same way that I do, because I'm in the same situation you are. I have the smallest house on the block. We look and think, oh, my house is small. But to our credit, we're both living in them.
So when you think about these trends, project out for us. Obviously, we're several decades now past the time you were describing those particular trends, and they've continued to develop in various ways. But kind of project for us beyond where we are now. What do you see down the road if the kinds of social trends with regard to work and economics continue? What's the outcome of those would you project?
Yeah. Well, I think to understand that, we've got to look at the underside of what I was writing about in the 90s, which is, it's not just that our living standards are going up, that we're working long hours, that those have really problematic impacts. So starting with the work time, people work all the time. The quality of their social relations really goes down. And we can see this in data on loneliness. We can see it in data on, time spent with friends and family and so forth. And that fraying, the fraying of social connection, in part, not only, but in part because of long working hours. Now, other people may point to media, social media, or television, computers. There are multiple things there, but the work time, dual learner couples working about 3,500 hours a year, increases of now in the period I looked at, a half a job, additional half a job, and then that's continued until the present day, because as more women moved into the workforce and worked longer hours, those family hours rose a lot. So just that time squeeze that families experience. So that's the first part. So there, and I just read an article today about what is it that gives happiness? What is it that gives health and well-being? The number one factor is social relations. And so the time squeeze, it's not just about, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had some more time? It directly undermines our well-being in the world, because time for connection, social connection, and deep social connection, that's at the absolute core of a good life. The second piece of it is that all that production we're doing is destroying the planetary ecology. And that's very direct relationships there. And I've done a lot of work showing that where you have high hours of work, you have much higher carbon emissions, for example. But, a lot of work on the eco footprint, ecological overshoot. I mean, on all these dimensions, it's all tied to production. And so we're in this, people call it the great acceleration, that post-war period in which suddenly we're doing so much more of everything. There is some population there, but the other big thing is the tremendous increase in how much people are consuming all around the world. So that system that I was writing about, that work and spend system, is destroying the bases of the good life. It's destroying social relations. It's destroying the planet, our well-being, etc.
So let me kind of insert maybe what might be a kind of parenthetical question, but I think seems to me an important one. We seem to be at this is obviously something that's not new to our own day, but let me call it like a free market fundamentalism, in which there's this sort of presumption that the answer to every social ill we have is some sort of free market response. Give us kind of some of your take on that.
Well, I've always thought it was a kind of a big con, the
Hmm.
whole idea of the quote unquote free market. I mean, it's never existed. All markets are structured, and they're structured in one way or another. In the United States, if you think about some of the most important sectors that we have, agriculture, of course, our military spending, which is a huge fraction of what the government does, the automobile sector, uh, you know, area after area, especially where we're talking about the places where we have big companies, the government structures these industries. Energy is another one. I mean, they subsidize them, they structure them, they set the rules, etc. So, and of course, so many of our sectors are duopolies. Coke and Pepsi. Or, car manufacturing. We've got two dominant domestic car manufacturers. All right, we're a little bit more in car manufacturing than two, but you can go down the line in a lot of cases, and Uber and Lyft, you've got basically two options. So the theory of the free market is based on lots of little producers, none of whom have any impact on the market. And they're all subjected to the competitive pressures of the market. And it doesn't, I mean, it's a theory about an economy that doesn't exist. And especially, in the area, my little patch of ground, work time and consumer issues, one of the things about that model of the free market and why the people who advocate for it, the grounds on which they advocate for it, one of the big assumptions of it is the opposite of what we were just talking about. It's that, number one, our preferences are exogenous, meaning they're given and they don't change based on what we consume. We already talked about why that's not the case. And the other one is that what I want doesn't affect what you want. And we call that idea is that preferences are not interdependent across people. So the fact that, you decided to get a bigger house doesn't affect whether I want to. And we know, we just spent a lot of time talking about the social influences to spend. And so as long as you have those interdependent preferences, the basic tenets of the quote unquote free market no longer hold, because the better thing is for somebody to come in and sort of slow down the race, right? Slow down the spiral of more. It's like, I always liken it to, being at a sporting event and somebody gets up to get a better view. And of course, they do get a better view at first, and then a few more people get up and they get the better view. But once everybody stands up, no one has a better view, right? Because what you did just influenced what I do. Your standing up makes me have to stand up too. Now, the best solution here is for the announcer to get on the microphone and say, "Sports fans, everybody sit down," because standing up, our legs are tired, right? That's kind of what I'm arguing has happened in America.
That's fascinating to me. So the two things you said, that the picture of the free market, what I was calling free market fundamentalism, is premised on the notion of exogenous desires, which is that our desires are somewhat static rather than being socially formed. And second, the free market fundamentalism presumes against the notion of interdependent desire.
Yes.
That's just fascinating. Yeah, that is fascinating to me.
And, they'll never talk about those pieces of it. And part of the reason is that once you have interdependent desire, it blows all the basic premises that the free market story is about out of the water, because the free market story says no announcer. The announcer is the government telling us to sit down or getting us to sit down, or, but what is that free market story about? It's just let companies do what they want without any interference. And that it's no one connects those consumer assumptions. I mean, economists know, if they're being honest, economists know that those assumptions about consumers, or what they call agents in the economy, are really crucial to those conclusions that they come up with, which are the basis of the whole free market story. And of course, the other piece of it is that, and the irony of it is that the period of time when the free market story became ascendant, which is starting in the 1980s, in the United States with Reagan, in the UK with Margaret Thatcher, the so-called neoliberal period, that's a period in which government support of subsidies, et cetera, to companies just is enormous. So it's a lie.
So let's move to maybe a picture of where you might wish we could go, what it might look like. And I was really fascinated with in the end of your latest book, 4 Days a Week, in the conclusion, you say, you speak of a, quote, path to healing our troubled world. And then in the last 5 lines of the book, you say, we need to dig deep to develop the most humane versions of ourselves. Capitalism accelerated everything. Now we've got to decelerate the pace of daily life in order to give ourselves time to think, connect, and act. We need to slow down and focus on what really matters, which is thriving and surviving. We have a planet and people to protect. And I suppose in the same way, in your book, Plenitude, the subtitle, The New Economics of True Wealth, you're asking similar sorts of questions, right? Of what does it mean for us to really focus upon what is going to be, what ought to be central to us? So begin to unpack some of that for us.
Yeah. So a little bit of the story of how I came to write 4 Days a Week, which is the book that I've just published. After the Overworked American was a bestseller. I was like all over the news, invitations here, there, and everywhere. And it was a lot of resonance of this for this idea. Front page, New York Times book review, rave review, at a time when that used to really matter. So and there was widespread support for the ideas in the book, not just from people, liberals, but all the way over, conservatives worried about family values and so forth. So it really struck a nerve across the spectrum. So I was hopeful that some things would start to happen, and I either was approached by or reached out to some corporations to talk to them about, let's do some interventions here in your company to try and reduce hours of work. I think it's going to improve people's well-being. I think that, it'll be economically viable for you, the company, et cetera. So I had a series of conversations, and in the end, none of them went anywhere. And then the issue just kind of dropped off as we got more into austerity, and of course the worsening income distribution really captured a lot of attention, as it should, and there really wasn't anything happening. During the pandemic, things started to change, and I was approached by someone who was interested in, he was going to run a trial of companies that were going to give their employees a 4-day work week, 32 hours, so not a compressed 4-day, 32-hour work week with no reduction in pay. And the trial, the organizers were going to try and help the companies figure out how to do it productively, like have people, just produce what you did before. You just give people that extra day. And so finally, here's an opportunity to really push this idea forward. And that's what I've been working on. Just so important to me because if people were stressed out when I wrote The Overworked American, came out in 1992, oh my, 2022, the pandemic, they were just flat out. I mean, you had the Great Resignation, you have quiet quitting, you have, people just stress beyond imagination. They're just, everything that was happening was like so difficult for people. And a lot of it was workplace dynamics, not only, but that confluence of workplace demands and then, everything that's happening outside of the workplace. So these trials, and we can get into the details of what happened with them. They've been an incredible success for the employees and the employers. And we've had hundreds of companies and more than 10,000 workers all over the world. They are dramatically changing people's lives. And for some of the reasons that we were talking about earlier, number one, people need time. Time is a vital resource for us to connect with each other, to connect with the earth and the ecosystems, to communicate with each other, to come together in solidarity, to try and fix what's wrong. In a world where more and more things are going wrong. I just don't think we can do it if people don't have time. And work is the thing that takes up so much time.
I do want to dig into a lot of the particulars of those studies. But before we go there, we've already used the word thrive, flourishing, the good life a number of times. And what would you say for you is the sort of basis for that vision for you? Or another way to put my question, what gives for you specificity to the notion of human flourishing or thriving? What does it mean to thrive, or what does it mean to flourish, and what's the source or the authority or the basis upon which you would advance those as pertaining to flourishing?
I think the number one thing from which much else flows is meaning. For a person to thrive, they have to have meaning and purpose in their life. Now, when I wrote Plenitude, the book you referenced, I started the chapter, I sort of laid out a model for people of how to live differently. And I was talking about the many kinds of wealth, not just financial wealth, but time wealth and ecological wealth, wealth in community. But I started that chapter by saying, each of us has to, I can't tell you what should be important to you, right? I can't tell you what should give your life meaning. That's for each of us to figure out what it is that gives our life meaning. And there are many different ways to have meaning in life. Once you have that, then you need the conditions that allow you to realize that meaning. So if your meaning in life is your family, you have to have time to be with them, because social relations, the bedrock of social relations is time, spending time together. Maybe your meaning in life comes from serving others. So it's you have to have a situation where you can do that, etc. So for some people, it's sitting with a math problem. And for others that would be torture. So I can't put content into human flourishing, but it is certainly having that meaning and then having the freedom and the resources to be able to achieve the things which give you meaning in life. So, that's where, there's a lot of work, much of it done by my former colleague, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, and sort of, what are the things which give us capabilities to do what we need? So, we have to have food and shelter and, basic needs met, that sort of thing. That all feels, pretty straightforward. It's really hard to flourish if you're hungry. It's hard to flourish if you're insecure and have precarious work. It's hard to flourish if you don't have bodily autonomy and bodily safety, and psychological safety. So if you're being bullied or you're being controlled or abused, or, none of those things are compatible with human flourishing. But once you have those sort of basic sort of basic needs, safety, and, human dignity. I think that to me, it's the meaning and the time. Those are if you have a lot of time but no meaning, you're going to be bored and unhappy. If you have a lot of meaning but no time, you're going to be very frustrated.
We are most excited to announce that we'll be having our second NSC Plus book club with an author on June 26th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Professor Rebecca DeYoung will join us to discuss her book, Glittering Vices. It's a great book. Order your copy of the book and mark your calendars. If you're not yet a member of NSC Plus, join at the link in the show notes or visit nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus. Show up with questions and get ready to sit in on a great conversation. It's fascinating to consider the obviously there's some who want to point to certain things that we can observe about the natural human experience or natural human relations as a way to think about flourishing. Others are going to point back to some sort of given theological tradition or philosophical tradition. And I will say, I guess the notion of it simply being each individual chooses what is meaningful to them. You're not going to like what I'm about to say, I don't think, but I'd love to hear what you say. Almost sounds like a free market fundamentalist myth to me. I don't know how do you react to that?
It's a great point. And once you started, I was like, So you caught me up there. I guess I would say the following. I also believe, and those last lines of my book where I was, contemplating. I wrote those the summer before the 2024 election. I was contemplating, things could get very grim in our country. I think that has happened. That need for solidarity. So I absolutely agree with you. And that point about human relationships being really key to flourishing. I do think as a society, we have to have that. We need connection. We need solidarity with each other in the same way that I don't think we can be healthy human beings if the planet is dying. Mm-hmm. If our human community is dying, we do need that for sure. So I guess where I'd maybe come a little bit in the middle in a world where that human community and solidarity is flourishing, then the person who just wants to sit in their room doing math problems, that they're probably able to flourish. To me, it's maybe more of that underlying condition that we need.
Yeah, right. I do. Then the last kind of point or thing to raise with you on this question of thinking about flourishing and what this looks like communally, I do wonder. It kind of struck me as I was reading some of your work that there almost seems to be this sort of interesting parallels with Catholic social teaching. In the way that you talk about solidarity, you've mentioned 2 or 3 times already, concern for the earth, the dignity of the worker, the dignity of work. Has that tradition informed your thinking in this in any regard, or is that just a happenstance of parallels?
I think it's a more happenstance. It's also the case that I've spent the last 25 years at a Jesuit university. But I haven't made a lot of study of Catholic social teaching, but I have always felt a lot of affinity for it.
Yeah.
So,
that doesn't surprise me. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your 4-day workweek conversation. Talk to us more about what was discovered on the backside of these experiments. You said that it was good for the workers, good for employees, and good for employers. So let's talk a little bit more first about good for employees. What are some of the quantitative markers that indicate that it was good for employees?
So So my team has done extensive surveying of all of these companies, hundreds of companies that have been involved around the world. And we have 20 well-being indicators, probably a little bit of overkill, but there are many of the things you might imagine. Stress, burnout, anxiety, fatigue, positive emotions, negative emotions, 5 or 6 satisfaction indicators, and then issues around balance and conflict between work and family, work and life, exercise, sleep problems, etc. Every single one of those goes up. Statistically significant increases, in some cases very large. Almost 69% of the people in our overall sample are less burned out after 6 months. And we have what's called a within subjects. So it's the same person. We're surveying them before it starts and after, 6 months after, and then again at 12 and 24 months. So on all those metrics, we find these well-being increases. And then we ask, well, why? What is it about the 4-day week that causes that? The first answer we get is people are working fewer hours, kind of obvious, but working fewer hours, and that's what's driving the well-being. And it turns out that the larger the work time reduction, the bigger the well-being increase. Not everybody actually kind of reduces by a full 8 hours a week. There's some people who do a little bit of work on the weekend or on the off day and so forth. And then we ask, well, what is it about working less that makes people so much? It's not obvious why working less would make you better off. And there are two pieces to it. One is the more obvious pathway. It's the things that happen outside of work. People exercise more, they sleep more, they're less fatigued. So kind of behavioral responses. But the second one is really fascinating. And this sort of bleeds a little bit into why it's working for employers. We're asking people a number of questions about their own productivity and their working habits and so forth. The first question we asked was, what is your what's called current workability, like your workability at the current time in comparison to your lifetime best? That thing shoots up. It's like the huge increase. And also their productivity, just rate your productivity goes up. There's a smart working scale we use. That goes up. I mean, they improve on all of these things. And that turns out to have a huge impact on their well-being. They're just feeling way more on top of their jobs and their work lives. They're not exhausted when they go into work on Monday mornings. They tell us they don't have the Sunday scaries on Sunday nights. So it's that combination of it enhances their work experience, and they also just have time outside of work to do a lot of things that make them feel better.
And you have this 100-80-100 rule, which I find a helpful snapshot. Could you describe that for us?
Yeah. Now, that's the employer side of it. So this model was originated by an entrepreneur in New Zealand named Andrew Barnes, and he tried it out in his own company, and it was a great success. And he started the NGO that ran these trials. The employee gets 100% of the pay, only has to work 80% of the time, but pledges to get 100% of their work done in the 4 days rather than the 5. Now, in the trials, we understand that this is not mostly an individual thing. So the companies spend months before they go onto the 4-day week doing what's called work reorganization. They make their organizations more efficient. They cut down on unnecessary meetings. They give people more focused time. They go through all the things, they look at the forms they're requiring. Lots of things that they're doing. And it really varies. Like the brewery has a different process than the marketing agency, but they all go through that. And that's the employer success piece of it. which is they do manage. They say they manage to either maintain or increase productivity for the most part. Not in absolutely every occupation in every company, and there are some places where they might need to. In a few cases, we hear they'll do a little bit of hiring to cover a division that just can't manage with 4 days, but they'll get other savings elsewhere, or they save a lot of money because people stop leaving, and turnover is very expensive. And in some of the really high turnover kinds of companies, we have like the hospital chain or other healthcare, the restaurants. They pretty much we just have to stop this massive exodus of people, which is costing us so much. So they're not asking for 100%. They're just, people were so burned out, they're just giving them a break. So I call those 180-80 companies.
Yeah. So if you had those 20 indicators that you tracked with regard to employees, what were the indicators of success with regard to the employers that you tracked?
So that was more difficult because we have a lot of small. This is mostly small and medium-sized enterprises, and many of them don't collect a lot of data, and many of them are white-collar. Although we have manufacturing, construction, et cetera, the bulk are white-collar, so they don't have productivity indicators. So what we got from them are revenue, absenteeism, new hires. We also asked for energy use, and there's one more that it'll come to me. We also asked them to rate the trial on overall productivity, on performance, and on ability to attract new employees. And then the ultimate test is really, did they stick with it? And so we have a model actually that predicts what it is. The vast majority stick with it. Something like 90% after 1 year are still on the 4-day week. And it's even higher than that. The few of the companies that dropped out never really instituted it. They were kind of really early dropouts. So to me, that's like the most relevant criteria because their revenue can go up or down. Like if, we had one country that had a recession while the trial was going on, or things like that. Then some of the companies have very detailed KPIs, key performance indicators, or OKRs, organizational. I don't even remember what OKRs stand for. And, those generally show really great improvements in the companies who keep that kind of data.
Huh. So I can imagine somebody asking how possibly on the 100-80-100 rule, 80% of the time, but 100% of the productivity, how possibly could that be the case?
Number one, there's lots of evidence from historical evidence of work time reduction that doesn't lead to more hiring because people actually make up a lot of the work. So there's slack in every organization. And so one of the things this does is it tightens things up. But a lot depends. I have stories about different kinds of organizations in the book, how they do it, how it is that they get 100% in those 4 days. For some, it's what we might call process engineering. So they're going through every step of what they're doing and figure out where they're wasting time. For a lot of the white collars, it's about their meetings. They have way too many meetings, inefficient meetings. They take too long. Too many people go to them. People hate them. They really tighten up on those. They create focus time so people can actually get a lot more done. They learn how to prioritize and stop doing things that were not really very valuable. But here's a great example that we got from, this is an internet service provider company in Canada. They service the northernmost regions where you don't have broadband, so they're using satellites. And a lot of their work is customer service, people calling up, I can't link up, help me. They got a massive new contract at the time the 4-day week started. And so when we went back to interview them at the end of the 6 months, we were sort of like, oh, that must have been a nightmare for you with all that new demand. And they said, no, actually, the 4-day week was what made it possible because people would have been too burned out otherwise. And I'm still scratching my head. And then it comes out, and I think this is really common, and it came out in some of my interviews for the book. There are a lot of things that you could do now to save you time later. So investment, like think about getting a new piece of software. You should spend time at the beginning learning about all its functionality because it will save you time later on. But we almost never do that. We just start using it, right? Well, with these customer service people in tech, they weren't documenting what they were doing. And so every customer service rep had to reinvent the wheel. The 4-day week forced them to document. Now, it's something they should have been doing all along. And as I asked a lot of people this in my interviews, well, like, why weren't you doing this? And, I got answers like, we were just trying to keep our head above water, or nobody has the time to do that. We just don't, this standard economic model assumes that we're always optimizing. But Herb Simon got a Nobel Prize for saying that we satisfice. We get a lot. We satisfice. We do satisfactory as opposed to maximizing. And I think you see a lot of that, especially you're not going to see it in the, some of the really big, very manufacturing companies exposed to a lot of international competition. They did a lot of that optimizing early on, but I had a fascinating dinner at, I mentioned it in the book, when I gave my TED Talk. Bill Gates invited me to a dinner, and I sat next to a close associate of his and some other, presidents of tech firms and stuff around me, and we were talking about my topic, the 4-day week and the meetings, and they just regaled me with story after story about how much time they wasted preparing for and being in meetings. These are like the most valuable companies in the world. And they have highly dysfunctional meetings cultures. So
how do you, for those who are listening and say, okay, if I wanted to explore this, next steps, there's reading your book is the obvious next step. And then what might it look like to begin out of that study to begin to explore whether this could be something that's feasible for any given company?
So to some extent, it depends on who you are. So if you are in senior management, I think the thing to do is to start reading and talking to people, ideally in your own industry, who have done it and how they did it. If you are a well-resourced company, there's a growing number of people who make their living helping companies do this, because many of them were people I was, involved with in these trials. I mean, this is like a revolutionary movement that happened, because it really showed the viability of this, not just for the workers, which I think everybody always knew workers would like a 4-day week, but does it really work for the companies? If you are an individual, and you want to get you're not in management, again, read the books, but then there are resources online, how to talk to your boss about a 4-day week. There are also organizations now that have sprung up. There's a wonderful organization called work4.org, which is trying to push on this. And they've developed a community of practice in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they're bringing together organizations that are interested in learning about it and maybe taking some steps. So you could get a group of people together. There aren't new trials going on yet, but states are also filing bills. Legislators are filing bills to start pilot programs in states. So 2 were filed in New York State last month. You'll like this one. A GOP legislator in Maine filed a bill for a pilot study with tax incentives for the companies. And what he said was the people of Maine work hard. They should not just they should be able to thrive, not just strive. That was his quote for the papers.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
In our given context, GDP is typically looked upon as, the great indicator of whether we're doing well economically. But I suspect you would say that's a quite unhelpful. The way we measure that is quite unhelpful. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So GDP ceased to be a good measure of well-being back in the 1970s. So it's really interesting if you look at you take an alternative measure like the genuine progress indicator, which I had some involvement with because they use my data for work time, or human development, kind of all of these alternative measures, which are broader well-being and quality of life measures, not just GDP. They all moved together with GDP until the 70s, at which point they started to diverge. For the reasons that we have been talking about, which is the reasons that people had to work longer hours, they went into debt, social fabric begins to fray, ecosystems start to break down. All of those things which are really key begin to go in the wrong direction. And of course, inequality being a huge dimension of this also starts to go in the wrong direction. A highly unequal society is almost always a not good life society. And that there's just so much evidence about that, the correlations between relationships between a more equal distribution of income and lots of well-being indicators, whether we're talking about individual health or, social health, social well-being. So, I mean, the GDP, it was never meant to have that sort of pride of place that it took, because economists always understood how flawed a measure it is. Their typical example was always, if a man marries his housekeeper, the GDP goes down because he used to pay her money to do housework and he no longer does. But okay, that's like a weird sexist example they always use. But here's the really important one. You have a massive oil spill. The GDP goes up because you count all the money that gets spent cleaning it up. But there's nothing on the other side for the damage. There's no value to nature. There's no value to time. If you increase a society like ours, increases its working hours, its GDP goes up, we're not measuring the loss of free time on the other side. It's just a one-sided.
Right.
It's only got one side of the ledger.
Right.
How could it be a good measure?
Yeah. So it just goes back to the importance of discerning what we are measuring, right? And it's leaving out so many of the things that we would, in a clearer sense, know are worth a great deal, but we're simply not measuring them.
It's a measure of market activity. So when you have big shifts from non-market to market, you look like everything's going great. Or you're running down ecological stocks, ecosystems. You're not counting that. It looks like everything's going great. Yeah.
So last question on 4-day work week. I can imagine as well that a lot of people would say, and this seems like such a huge radical shift that they can't even begin to get their heads around the possibility that such a thing would change. But you point out that the 40-hour work week itself was a similarly drastic change.
Yeah, and I think even more so. 40-hour work week. Remember, 85 years ago, we've been waiting that long to reduce the work week. But, I do think the pandemic has changed the way people think about the 4-day week. So pre-pandemic, when I would argue for things like the 4-day week, people thought, great idea, we'll never get it. It just felt utopian. I think, or aspirational. What's happened now is that people see it as common sense. It's fascinating. Not everybody, obviously, but I think the average person in the street and, the people that came up in our studies, it feels like common sense to them. And here's how I started to realize that was happening. The first company in our study in the U.S. Is a healthcare information provider, and I was interviewing the head of their customer service. She told me when she called her biggest client to tell them that she was no longer going to work on Friday, their response was basically, "You go, girl, like good for you." And we have a CEO in the study who they put an out of office message saying, our company works a 4-day week. And she says she gets back responses to that, all in caps, tons of exclamation marks, like, wow, that is so great. And that wouldn't have happened before. Before, people would have thought, what's wrong with those people? Why are they so lazy? Or, people just know. There was a tag, something we heard a lot from the employees was 2 days is not enough, meaning a 2-day weekend is not enough. And people just know it. People just know it. I've been surprised at how little criticism the idea has gotten since we've been doing a lot of publicity. We started these trials in 2022. They've gotten a lot of publicity. At first, it was hard to get anyone to criticize them.
So it sounds like you feel quite hopeful about the possibility that this may get increasing traction.
Oh, I do. We have, I think, 11 states now that have introduced bills. There are bills in Congress. I don't think we're going to get legislation anytime soon to change the work week. But one of the things I argue in the book is we are evolving away from a 5-day week. Because if you look at what people are doing on Fridays, it's a lot different. And it's showing up in sort of hard economic statistics. Friday is becoming a different day. We're now at the beginning of summer hours. We already know Friday's a different day in the summer.
Right.
And we have companies that started that way and then just started extending it through the year because it works.
Yeah. As we move toward a close, I would love to hear what this looks like for you personally. How have you developed routines, habits in which you have lived into your own preaching, if you will? Or could you share with us any ways in which you are not yet satisfied with your own life rhythms and routines as living up to what you describe as what would be best for us?
So I had an epiphany the other day. I've been asked this question. I mean, ever since I wrote The Overwork American, people always say, well, how many hours do you work? And, in those days, I would say, well, I work a lot of long hours, but I also, I spend a lot of time, on the phone or it's socializing while I'm at work. Or, I never felt like I was overworked. As a professor, once you get tenure, you control your time a lot. And then when the 4-day week stuff started, I was very frequently asked, how many days a week do you work? And I would say, well, I don't really know. I work when I feel like it and not, and that was sort of true. I mean, I was always telling the truth about this. So I was working on Fridays as well as the other days, but I was also like, when I felt like not working, I would not work. I didn't feel overworked. I was asked this the other day and I realized actually, a Friday has evolved, not consciously, but it has evolved for me into a day when I really don't do too much work. I go to the gym in the middle of the day on Friday. I don't do that on any other day. I do it like before the workday starts during the week. I often will have, like social appointments I'll make on Fridays, or, I might do a little work in the morning, but generally speaking, I too, not consciously, but just I have evolved into using Friday in a different way. So, and for anyone who's listening, I can say that if you can manage that, it's really great. I would do what you can.
Been talking to Juliet Schor, economist, professor of sociology at Boston College, about her newest book, 4 Days a Week. Julie, thanks so much. It's been a delightful conversation. Thankful for the provocative vision you're giving us to consider and reconsider our vision of a good life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Hey friends, Lee Seacamp of No Small Endeavor here. Hey, would you like to expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about? Here is an easy way to do that. And I would be most grateful if you were to do so. Go over to your favorite podcast listening app, click on Reviews, and leave No Small Endeavor a glowing 5-star review. Tell folks perhaps about some episode you liked in particular, and tell folks what you like generally about No Small Endeavor, the topics, the dashingly handsome, articulate host, or whatever it is that floats your boat. That will help more people find us, which will expand the community of people talking about the things you like to talk about, especially when you make it one of those 5-star reviews. Thanks. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.